Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining for this panel about claims. I'm, as you can see, Jamie Ballantyne, the Director of Marketing and Communications for Gold Standard. I'll start with an apology because I've slightly lost my voice. One of my team said I sounded like a dying chicken. So if I can't say anything later, that's why, if I'm lost for words. Claims is something that I'm particularly interested in as someone who works in communications. It's about the power of language to motivate action across society and in companies in particular. Making the right claim allows organisations to motivate themselves, their staff, their consumers, and to tell a compelling story of kind of climate action that importantly can be backed by kind of credible and verifiable evidence. So without further ado, I'd like to kind of turn to our panel and ask them to introduce themselves briefly and talk about themselves and what their role is. So Renat, I'll turn to you first, if that's okay.
Sure, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me here. Thanks for joining this session, second day afternoon. Always a tough one, but I'm sure you'll find it worthwhile. Because we're talking about the most important topic, of course, which is the claims. And the claims is very important, as you just mentioned, because that's ultimately what a company gets back as a reward for participating. My name is Renat. I'm the CEO and the co-founder of Southpole. And before Southpole, which we founded 17 years ago, we founded also the My Climate Foundation. That's already 21 years ago, which was back then one of the first NGOs. It was a foundation which brought the climate neutral claim to Europe. And back then, in the beginning, nobody understood what climate neutral meant. They didn't even understand. People were actually, they didn't even understand that climate was a problem at all. Even at our university where I studied, it wasn't called climate, it was called atmospheric physics. That's what we studied. So climate neutral inspired a lot of companies, thousands of companies. If you Google today, you will find 46 million hits on the term climate neutral or carbon neutral. However, back over the past couple of years, a problem started emerging, which was perhaps even two problems. One was that a lot of, in absence of regulation in many countries, a lot of companies started to self-declare themselves all kind of things. I'm climate neutral, I'm climate positive, I'm climate this, climate that. There was not much regulation, so companies started to do many things themselves. And the second problem, and I think that's one topic we discussed about, was that the climate neutral claim has a level of unclarity. If this glass here is climate neutral, you never quite know, is this because of reductions or because of offsets? And that is not something consumer groups like a lot, this unclarity, because there could be greenwashing. And admittedly, there have been some cases of people greenwashing. So I think, and then I stop for here, it is time to rethink, to become more transparent, more robust. So that's why we propose, and we have launched this morning after a long consultation, to do a new claim, which is simply funding climate action. Why funding climate action? Ultimately, we have absolutely no time left. It's 7 years to go to 2030. You have seen last week, Paris, Macron summit, not much going on, a little bit of bonds here, bonds there, but we have a lack of funding. And even if everybody reduces emissions to zero here in the UK or in Switzerland, where I'm from, that still is not enough. There's countries that have neither the funding nor the technology to really go to net zero. So we need funding climate action, and we invite all companies to do exactly that.
Great, thank you so much, Renat. Rob, would you now like to do a similar introduction to yourself?
Yeah, I might keep it slightly shorter because I think we've got some questions to respond to in a moment. So I'm Rob Moore. I lead the Sustainable Finance and Carbon Markets team in the International Directorate of the newly formed Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. we have existed for a lot less time than Renat has been working in the area. But I was also previously the lead climate finance negotiator for the UK during the COP26 presidency. So whilst we're focused on domestic now and how we what we do in the UK, we're obviously very attuned to some of the challenges at the global level that Renat just spoke to. Previously worked in the UK Treasury also on domestic climate change policy, and did a master's degree which did include climate change in the title, so probably a slight age differential there, but thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Lydia.
Hi, thanks so much for having me today. I'm Lydia Sheldrake, Director of Policy and Partnerships at the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. And VCMI was set up in the run-up to COP26 to address exactly this question. So I agree with Renat, it's an absolutely essential piece of the puzzle, the credibility of claims. VCMI was set up to address the demand-side integrity of voluntary carbon markets and plug the critical gap on what good looks like when it comes to use of carbon credits and the claims that corporates make. So we've been through a long journey since then, and excited to say a bit more about that through the course of today. In my role, I cover policy, partnerships, communications, and stakeholder engagement. And since we're sharing, also in my master's, I actually studied atmospheric physics, so maybe we've come full circle.
Great, thank you. And Owen, I mean, you've spoken a number of times on this stage already, but do you want to also just kind of do...
Yeah, I feel like a bit of a plant, but yeah, Owen, Chief Technical Officer at the Gold Standard. I think everybody knows what I do by now. But I think just, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. Renat framed it really nicely. I guess from my perspective, I came into the claims conversation from a more technical angle, and what I keep snagging on, the exam question I keep coming up against is, does the mechanism you design add up to the thing that it's being used for and what's being said about it? And oftentimes the answer in the last 20 years has been, no, it doesn't. And I think that's not always intentional, right? A lot of companies have been accused of greenwashing that have tried to follow the common practice, de facto good practice, and been called out for that, and have now realized that there's this gap between the technical and the claim. And then there are a few that have, intentionally done it the wrong way, I would say. But I would say more commonly is the inadvertent. And so a lot of my thinking, a lot of my work is around what is that ratio of technicality to claim, how can we shrink that gap, and how can we be more measured, and how can we avoid that kind of criticism. So yeah, I did geographical sciences. So. It's very cool, by the way.
I studied politics, so I feel very out of my depth on this panel. So just to explain, on this panel, I'm going to ask a couple of questions to our panelists, and then there will be an opportunity for anyone in the audience to ask questions as well. So do have a think about if you'd like to ask anything of our esteemed panelists as we go. So Renat, you've said that you've been thinking about claims for about 21 years now. So as someone with so much experience in the corporate claim space, what can you tell us? Can you expand a bit more on the shift in approach to corporate claims that you've seen over that time, and particularly recently?
Yeah, so I think the big shift, if you compare literally 20 years ago, back then, the problem was, once again, people didn't even understand what the climate was. They didn't understand that they're part of the problem. So as a sales pitch, well, you have a problem, and you have it, and I have a solution, and you have to pay for it. But like, what is this? And so back then, climate neutral was an easy catch phrase to just involve people and crowd in as many as possible. Now we have a different landscape. Now, more or less everybody who is, I don't want to do, I think I can, here we are converted in this room, but everybody with the brain still functioning knows that this is happening, it's a problem. But the new problem we have now is that a lot of people have switched straight from ignoring and denying climate to becoming completely doom and gloom. And that is, in my view, the big problem. We have a polarized world. People are angry, people are upset, people are protesting, and in this tense climate, intense situation, it has become difficult. As you just said, Owen, companies come out, try to do the right thing. immediately people go, oh, greenwashing, oh, that's bad. Why did you not meet your science-based target by 2% points? So for companies, it has become interesting to say, I'm doing nothing. And they try to hide. And so the thing is, the new set of claims we have to come out must be simple, honest, transparent, and inspirational. It must be a safe space for CEOs and the whole team to say, look, we have emissions. We're honest about it. We have calculated them. We have reduced them to what we can, and we pay, and we fund. That's it. I am now not green and clean and champion and hero and all. No. I think we are in a time where all those over-the-top attributes are out of fashion. We have to become robust and honest and just say what it is transparently. So that, I think, has changed quite a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more that good communications kind of is simple, honest, transparent, and inspirational. And I think if we can all kind of aspire to that, that will get us a long way. Owen, at Gold Standard, we recently published a discussion paper on high-integrity corporate action. Can you tell us a bit more about what we're doing in this space?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, the genesis of that, so it's our 20th anniversary, and I think there's been a similar sort of journey along the years with Southpole. We've always been kindred spirits and partners in that sense. And in that 20 years, I think we've gone from being a labeler and an issuer of carbon credits to starting to think more and more about how those things are used, and when they're used badly, what harm does that do? When they're used well, what benefit does it bring? So I guess the first sort of internal paradigm shift was probably around 2016 to start thinking around, okay, so these aren't credits issued in isolation. It's like producing arms or something and then saying, well, I didn't, it's not my fault somebody shot somebody with it, right? Like, it's a bit of an extreme example, but it's, how your stuff gets used is really important to us. We can't live with it if it's used badly and causes harm. So that was the kind of first starting point. And then as time has gone on, it's a bit sort of, the carbon market often leads the conversation because it's the thing that's most criticized, but it's also the most accessible, and of all of the climate actions companies take, one of the better understood ones. And so what we wanted to try and do was sort of put that down and say, look, let's not design company action by the tools they use. Let's design what we think companies should do, then make sure the tools fit that, and then make sure the claims fit that. And then in that order, you know that you aren't somehow using tools that obscure the fact that companies aren't doing the right thing in some cases. And so we set out our kind of vision of what we think a good company should be doing. It's a really basic thing at that level. And there's 5 principles in that. It's around governance, it's around acting on your value chain responsibilities, it's responsibility for ongoing emissions, there's the inevitable miscellaneous bucket, stop using single-use packaging, that kind of thing, and then there's good claims. And there's a QR code on one of the screens. I think people can go and download that report. And so that at one level was driven by, what's our policy position on a good company? Because then when we're taking technical decisions on things like carbon credits or Scope 3 or impact investing, does it do what we think a company should be doing? Because if it doesn't, then we've misdesigned the instrument. It can't be the other way around, because the instrument shouldn't design the company. So that was the first reason. And then when we looked at that, we thought, well, we have to provide some claims guidance to that. And we didn't want to go too detailed, but we did want to frame, okay, so if all of that's true, and this is the instrument you're going to use, what logically is the act? And I'd say there's a real nuance there, because you've got the act and you've got the claim. So previously, offset, carbon neutral. And we haven't defined the carbon neutral thing, if that needs to exist. That's a conversation that still needs to happen. But we have proposed a shift, a bit like Renat's Fund Climate Action, which is become a fair and positive contributor to global net zero by funding climate action. And then if you need to call yourself something, there's an interesting conversation to be had about that. Personally, I'm a technical guy. I'd leave it there. But I appreciate, that companies might see that differently.
Yeah. I mean, and this is a conversation that you and I have quite regularly about what the best way of wording this sort of stuff is.
We're really fun at parties.
We are really fun at parties. Great. Lydia, turning to you, what are VCMI going to be doing to ensure that carbon markets continue mobilising large scales of climate finance?
So the main headline from us is that tomorrow, in fact, we're very excited to release the VCMI Claims Code of Practice. So encourage you all to go to our website and register for that event. That claims code is a rule book that will establish integrity in the demand side of voluntary carbon markets at the market level, and establish claims that companies can make. We work hand in hand with the Integrity Council on voluntary carbon markets. So together, these two frameworks create a kind of common harmonized set of rules for integrity based on transparency that everyone has mentioned today for voluntary carbon markets. And I think it's fair to say that we've been at this a long time. So this represents 18 months worth of work. We've been through a global multi-stakeholder process. It's been shaped by our steering committee, our expert advisory group, as well as we've had inputs from governments participating in our country contact group, inputs from civil society, indigenous peoples, local communities, and we've also addressed feedback through an extensive public consultation and road test that we did with over 70 companies last year. So a huge amount of input, so it really represents a collective effort, and it's really great to see now at this point a huge momentum around the demand side, around claims, specific activities which Gold Standard and Southpole are doing, and looking to align within that broader work that we're doing at VCMI. So just in a nutshell, because you'll see some links which have come through to what Owen and Renat have said. The claims code, there are 4 steps in there that companies need to take. So first, the company meets a set of foundational criteria, and that's to ensure good corporate governance on climate before companies make use of carbon credits. So the similar things that Owen was talking about. So in essence, that's to ensure an and approach to decarbonisation and carbon credits rather than either or, which is often associated with traditional offsetting. In addition, then, once the company meets those foundational criteria, a company chooses a claim to make, and we've got a tiered set of claims which promotes increasing ambition over time. Number 3, a company retires high-quality carbon credits which align with the IC VCM eligibility criteria. And number 4, crucially, the company transparently reports on all of that through a monitoring, assurance, and reporting framework. So, and it's also important to say that through all of this, we've been working with the other key initiatives on corporate accountability, so Greenhouse Gas Protocol, SBTI, CDP, ICVCM, so that together this represents an integrated approach to corporate climate action, which ultimately brings all the pieces together and through our engagement with governments helps accelerate the pathway to ambitious policy and regulation, which is ultimately obviously where we need to be. So we see this sort of high integrity voluntary approach as a way of accelerating that runway to regulation.
Great, thank you so much. I look forward to that release tomorrow. Rob, how can government support high integrity corporate action? What's the role of government in this picture?
Well, it's probably quite broad, so I might focus here a little bit on the carbon market, but obviously that all intersects and all things are related. So I mean, firstly, if you look at the objectives that government has in this space, they broadly fall into 3 buckets. One is the sort of alignment of financial flows with climate or other environmental goals. One is the sort of consumer and investor protection angle. So how do we ensure transparency and integrity? And finally, the sort of growth angle. How do we ensure that the UK is well positioned? We were talking earlier about the offices that you guys have in London and how those have grown over the years. So how do you create, you know, a sort of the UK as an attractive place to be? Interestingly enough, the complexity of that within government is pretty significant. Just on the voluntary carbon market work, we have at least 3 or 4 core government departments before we get to the devolved administrations, and then about 5 regulators, all with different tools. And I sort of broadly bucket those up in a sort of particular set of ways. I mean, the first is that the government is actually involved, or arm's length bodies oversee the actual generation of credits in the UK, so it's the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code. Secondly, we will represent the UK in international negotiations, and they're the things that build consensus on what is effectively a global market that requires global and interoperable standards. Thirdly, and it's fitting that Lydia spoke just before me, the sort of initiatives that we support and we work with, so that includes VCMI, who we played quite a big role in the sort of the initial formation of, and we used a lot of our COP26 presidency capital to sort of support some of the initiatives that you'll have heard from over the course of the conference. We also work directly through our climate finance, but also through those domestic schemes to build capability and capacity on the supply side. And then finally, and this is probably the most pertinent for the sort of claims agenda, is through the setting of individual policy frameworks and regulations. So those include the sort of overall governance of climate and environmental policy initiatives, which would bring us out to quite an expansive discussion, but also the role of individual regulators who have their own codes of practice and things like that, that often draw from some of the work that's been done outside government over the years as this sort of risen up the agenda. So the CMA, the ASA, the FCA, those are the UK's respective consumer, advertising, and financial watchdogs or regulators, all have their own work streams working precisely in this space in a relatively dedicated way. And then finally, the role that the government has in setting the wider sustainability disclosure regime, which intersects with carbon, but does provide a wealth of information that allows consumers and investors to discern where carbon markets themselves sit within wider transition plans. And one thing that the UK also did, alongside sort of working with VCMI in its early inception days, was set up the Transition Plan Task Force as part of our COP26 presidency that was designed to develop a gold standard for, sorry to take the term, it's often used in informal settings, which I think is a sign of success, but designed to develop best practice in transition planning. So this all provides a real wealth of information, and I think the thing that we're often thinking about in a policy context is, there's no single right answer to this question. There's no single prescriptive, this is precisely what is allowed and this is precisely what is not. It's a fluid context with competing claims. You get a series of people who are all very, very capable, set them the same challenge, and then will come to you with different but equally good answers. And so how do we as policymakers weed through that and figure out what the role of public policy is versus what is better left to the private sector or to civil society to attempt to resolve, but ensure that the framework's in place that can be done. What we have done most recently is publish our green finance strategy. And that set out plans to consult relatively comprehensively on the role of government within the voluntary carbon market, and my team at the moment is in the process of scoping that consultation. So one of the things that government's job is to do is to listen. And so we do encourage everybody that's listening to think about engaging in that if your organisation is well placed to do so. And ultimately what we want to end up with is a world in which, there is a role, we were talking earlier about the scarcity of finance for climate action, that carbon credits are a source of finance, which if well used are additional to what companies are doing themselves on their own value chains, and can unlock much needed capital, both for domestic. We have a sort of 50 to 60 billion pounds per year financing need to implement our own domestic policies, but also the trillions internationally. And how do we come up with a system which sort of learns from some of the work that VCMI has done, some of the work that ICVCM has done, some of the work that's come before that through the likes of Southpole and Gold Standard, bundle it all up and have a policy framework that actually works both for us and for the the communities that we also want to support, both in the UK as sort of domestic stakeholders, but also through our development finance and through our capacity building initiatives, and make sure that whole system all sits together. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much indeed, all. I'm now going to ask some questions just to the whole panel, so feel free to chip in if you've got a perspective. What are some of the biggest opportunities to come, do we think, from this this change in approach to corporate claims? Owen, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think Renat framed it really nicely. In a way, the opportunity has always been there. That I think, particularly in maybe setting aside the kind of oil and gas companies who have a kind of different role to play and maybe not play. For all other companies, especially consumer goods-facing companies, the opportunity there has always been to manage the risk of impending regulation of claims and what they should be doing, and leverage the opportunity of differentiation, of responding to what their shareholders, their consumers want them to do. And Ivo de Boer spoke this morning about scale, rate, and risk. Scale, rate of return, and risk. And in a way, what we've seen is that the value of action is outweighed by the risk of getting criticised at the moment, and that is a function of, no doubt, some screechiness from some quarters, but also because of this mismatch of instrument and claim. So the opportunity, I think, is, it was right. I said earlier, like, you have this kind of ratio of mechanism, use, claim, and the ratio hasn't, really matched up, and you can do various things. You can make the claim more measured, you can tighten the instrument, and a lot of instrument tightening has gone on. So ICVCM has been doing a lot of work there to normalize some of the quality criteria of carbon credits. SBTI has normalized a science-based approach to the corporate value chain. And I think now we have VCMI looking at the more measured, more appropriate claim. So to me, those are all in their own ways enabling conditions to reduce this risk of being shouted down. Because nobody wants to go to their CEO and say, well, you should buy these carbon credits. And they go, if I buy those carbon credits, I'm going to get criticized. Or, if I do this action, I'm going to get criticized. So you could read the thing as quite defensive, I suppose, in some ways. But I also feel like it's kind of getting out of our own way and normalizing a level of behavior that is actually sustainable and scalable. I see the opportunity as those things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's how best, as I kind of said at the beginning, it's how best to use language to incentivize action, which is the most important thing. Does anyone else have a perspective you want to, Lydia?
Yeah, thank you. So, I think we all agree, and everyone in this room, that voluntary carbon markets have a really significant, potentially a really significant role to play in a context of huge financing gaps, a mechanism which can channel finance where it needs to go, as well as leverage forms of capital, deliver on sustainable development benefits for nature and people, as well as climate. But let's be honest, it's always been a relatively small market, relatively volatile, prices not where we need them to be. So I think the opportunity really comes from generating clear, common rules which can transform that kind of market into a mature and stable market, which is, build growth where we need it. So we need to turn complexity into clarity. We need to turn skepticism into trust, and fragmentation into harmony, so that we actually have a trusted market which can deliver and grow the financial value based on reputational value. That in a voluntary market, the value comes from the trust and the underpinning reputation, and that's really what we need to build with these new frameworks coming into place.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think I often say, you can't touch a ton of CO2 that hasn't been emitted. So how building the trust is the most important thing for the voluntary carbon market to do, and the claims that you make are a vital part of that. Rob, I think you wanted to.
As you say, I think one thing that is quite important at the moment is there is this sort of groundswell of momentum around things like net zero, and that has led to there being a lot of movement from sort of different component parts, as you were describing. And that expands beyond the immediate VCM space towards sort of broader financial regulation, possibly for the first time. And we have all of these commitments around GFANs, for instance, and the sort of the just level and scale of interest there is so much higher than it's been in the past. And I think the question is, how do you, now that you've got that, in almost sort of captured lightning in a bottle, actually make the most of it? And that's the really challenging bit. And I think some of this point is, now that we're moving to a world of sort of hopefully higher integrity and some sort of shared sense of standards and principles, how do we manage that sort of transition across? And that's going to be, I think, a really important part for us and a big challenge.
So I think for me, it's not so much the opportunities, the necessity is, once again, we have to scale massively the companies who reduce emissions, who engage in science-based targets, including their supply chains, which is very powerful, by the way. Plus, we need to scale climate finance to finance the transition beyond people's value chain. So in this sense, and I think we really all agree, and also Science-Based Targets has come out with, in my view, a very, very visionary document which creates this mitigation hierarchy, like avoid, reduce inside value chain, and then reduce beyond value chain. And I think the big opportunity we have right now is that we stop mixing those topics, because that mixing has caused all the problem. That unclarity, that has been the point of attack all the time. And I like to use the analogy. If you have a company, you need a policy for diversity on your board, and you also need a policy to avoid discrimination in your employee. You cannot say, because I have an anti-discrimination policy, I now no longer need diversity on the board. Right? Who would say it's either or? Of course, it's both. You need both policies. So that's the same with climate. You need both a robust reduction target, and you need a robust commitment to pay for emissions and contribute to climate action. And in this sense, that's perhaps the only one point to put a bit of spice on this panel, come on, we agree on everything. Let me disagree on one point, which is that in the VCMI guidance, you should only fund climate action after you have created all your foundation. I think that's too late. We have absolutely no time to wait. You should fund climate action right now, because you know where emissions are at that moment, pay for emissions while building the rest. Because I think we can no longer afford to basically wait for the perfect climate plan. Companies have to go out, and I really also hope for the community of NGOs and all stakeholders to rally behind both topics, reductions and the funding, at the same time, at scale.
I mean, I couldn't agree more with that, to be honest. I mean, we were sort of knocking this around internally, and you could say, well, we have this mitigation hierarchy of, reduce and then, abate your own emissions and then reduce beyond, but it's not a hierarchy, right? You're not credible if you do one or the other. We know from 20 years of painful history, if you just offset, you're going to get hammered for that. But actually, you should get hammered if you only have a science-based targets, because what that's saying is, I'm becoming less bad until the point I can say I'm good. You're still lighting matches, right? We've got a problem there. So I think science-based targets brought us to this kind of non-arbitrary space of what that target needed to be. But we really mustn't fall into the trap of thinking, well, as long as a company's credibly implementing a science-based target, they're credible. They're not, right? That is just becoming less bad. You have to also take responsibility for the emissions on that journey, or you're not credible.
Can I just come back? Because I just for a point of clarity, because I don't necessarily think we are disagreeing between the VCMI approach and the Southpole approach. So what we're saying as the foundational criteria is it's critical to demonstrate progress towards meeting your science-aligned targets. And in addition, while you're on that pathway, address the residual emissions, address the unabated emissions through purchasing carbon credits. So it's absolutely and both, not do one and then the other. We need to do all now, but we need to do it credibly. We need to be able to demonstrate how the mitigation hierarchy, how decarbonization is happening. And so putting a clear framework underneath that, which enables companies to confidently make claims around how they are purchasing carbon credits, as well as decarbonizing, without fear for getting called out for greenwashing, without fear for being called out in litigation, which we're seeing more and more of. So how do we persuade companies to take action, not to greenwash, not to green hush? We need to give a clear framework where they can actually be assured. So can you tick boxes? Can you get an auditor to tick boxes that you have done this, and then you can confidently say, make a claim which demonstrates that you're doing all of the above. And so that is exactly what is coming out in the claims code tomorrow. And I also think it's absolutely critical. So, whether we're here or wherever, we need to demonstrate a harmonized approach across demand-side integrity and supply-side integrity at the market level. And then there's obviously, there's space and there's room for innovation for particular organizations to dig into that. But we need to be clear how we are creating harmony and avoiding fragmentation in the marketplace. Otherwise, it will just lead to more confusion. Or how does what VCMI is doing come sit against Southpole, sort of about with gold standard, which is the right way, which is not. We need to be clear about how all of this comes together, create that safe space, more clarity, and avoid the confusion and the fragmentation. So just to put a point of clarity in there.
Great, thank you. An admirable attempt to add spice, but everyone agree nonetheless. So where do we see carbon markets growing and adapting over the next few years, do you think, to support these changes?
Sure. I think what I'd like to see, I suppose, is, when you look at that construct of abate your own emissions, take responsibility for your ongoing emissions as what's a different thing to a hierarchy, like a square or something, I don't know. What that construct is quite individualistic. So each company has their own inventory, each company has their own purchases of carbon credits, or however they take that responsibility. And that's good. I think, companies like a game where they're in control of whether they can win it or not. But the reality of some of those elements is you're not in control unilaterally. Like Scope 3 doesn't work like that. And I think what I think would be really interesting to see is a discussion around, do we have the right mechanisms of accountability? Like, is isolating each individual company the right way to do it? Or how, more interestingly, can we make that more collegiate and collective action driven? And I think where that comes out in the carbon markets is how we think about what should different sectors maybe focus on in terms of the activities they support. So maybe everybody at some level should be supporting, forests and nature and community services and access to energy. But then maybe some sectors could be more specific, stuff that they are especially well suited to pursue. And how do we align that with science? So at the moment, a company at the end of the year, totals up how many emissions left over. I need to go and buy that many credits, and I'll buy whatever's cheapest, whatever's available. If you're lucky, what I feel like buying based on the identity of my company. But better would be, I will buy an optimized mix of things that is aligned with science. That to me is the next frontier of how you make this really powerful. And I think maybe the other side of the same coin is that by rote way of working takes away some of the creativity of the companies themselves. So how can we work with companies that have interesting voices themselves, like the influence they might have in a certain part of the world, or an influence they have, maybe if you're a big fashion brand or something, maybe you have a big influence with, Asian buyers or something. How do you kind of leverage that, use your voice to educate? So I think unlocking the creativity while keeping the structure, I think is the other kind of frontier that I've got my eye on.
Yeah, I agree, and I think a previous panelist from Murmur talked about how you could use the arts to inspire action. So it's important. Does anyone else want to chip in on that point, or
perhaps one additional thought is, should you, Lydia, perhaps change the name of the association and perhaps drop the M? Why I'm asking this, it's a pretty provocative thought, but I have a feeling that one misunderstanding as well is when we all the time talk about this voluntary carbon market. Some people believe that our purpose is to create a market and then to trade and all make a lot of money. And that's a wrong perception completely. What we're after is the funding. We want companies to retire credits, to basically go out to the countries from UK to Switzerland to Mali to Paraguay to anywhere, and to fund the right projects to make a difference. And perhaps we have to be also on that level rethink our narrative and perhaps less talk about this market. Of course, the market makes things more efficient, but that's not the prime goal. What we want to achieve is just a scale-up of the funding. So just a thought that we have perhaps also to think of narrative change in that direction.
Perhaps I can buy Lydia some time to respond to whether or not to rename your organisation. But and also I can, as someone who's worked in public policy, can't be accused of trying to make too much money. So I think there's a link there, but just firstly to come back on some of those points. I think it's a really exciting time for the market I'll come back to that. In that there is this sort of emerging consensus and principles that we haven't seen before. I think even in this discussion today, we see we're talking about the same points, but we're using different language. That seeds some, in this context, quite quickly resolved confusion, and then okay, we're all in the same space, actually. Maybe it's because I'm a former UN negotiator, but you see that all over the place in climate diplomacy and carbon markets and everything. And I think one thing that's going to be a challenge is how do we navigate from this set of sort of a number of initiatives coming out with principles that are all broadly saying the same thing and turn it into a common lexicon that we can all use. And that's going to be a real challenge. It's something that even within government is challenging. Like I said, 3 or 4 government departments, 4 or 5 regulators. It is in of itself a challenge just internally. And then the other thing, I think, is this point of that we talked about a little bit in the claims question a moment ago. How do we also develop a terminology that isn't self-congratulatory, isn't greenhushing, does recognize the urgency of the problem, does recognize, in a perfect world, we would be somewhere where there's lots of money and there's lots of internal action and everyone's doing everything. But realistically, what we need is that to sort of codify that in a bit of a value proposition that the private sector will be responsive to, at least on the market side. Coming over to the other side, I mean, we know that there will be a negotiation over the next year on a new global climate finance goal. I was in the presidency team at COP when we actually agreed the process for setting that. And then there's also the Bridgetown agenda and the whole reform agenda. So there is this wider discussion of how do we just get more money into the system full stop. And I think, a lot of the concepts that we talk about here, they apply to carbon markets and carbon credits, but they also apply to wider climate finance. And the interaction between those two is really important. And one thing that I think we're quite cognizant of is we are in a world where a lot of companies are going to be behind on their science-based targets. We're also in a world in which there is a dearth of finance in emerging and developing economies. And how do we somehow think about if there's any sort of synergies there that can be mutually beneficial and reinforcing and not sort of reductive and not lead to, avoiding doing what needs to be done today. So I think that's really important too.
Yeah. Thank you. Lydia.
So I have to consult my comms colleagues on the name of VCMI, but one thing I can agree more with is on the need for a shared narrative, a shared terminology, a way of talking about this. I think a lot of what we've talked about today is how to build and ensure a safe space for organizations to buy and sell assets, carbon assets, make claims, and that is a mechanism to unlock finance. I think the way that we have thought about it is how to turn voluntary carbon markets, which have been relatively niche, volatile, into a much more stable, mature, trusted market. And so that's why we've been thinking about it as a market. How do you create a structure which creates a safe space to dramatically grow finance, which is going through the system? We absolutely do not want it stuck in secondary trading and creating, huge profits. For traders, bankers somewhere, this market is a voluntary market. It exists for a public purpose. So we need to put all the pieces in place to make sure that the finance is actually going to the ground and going where it needs to go for climate, people, and nature. So I think it's just to say, actually, maybe we need to be thinking about the wider sweep of mechanisms and pulling all the pieces together. So IOSCO earlier in this year, we're consulting on financial regulation in carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets. So that's a really interesting piece to come in. So we can come back to the name, but ultimately I think it's the mature, trusted marketplace. However you want to call it, and maybe market is traditionally associated with that secondary trading, etc. And actually what we're talking about is a purposeful, high-value system which generates impact for essentially what are public goods.
Great, thank you very much all. We'll now turn to the audience. So if anyone has any questions, please kind of put your hands up. And yes, at the back there. There should be some microphones coming. just say who you are, where you're from to start off the question?
Yes, thank you. I'm Gilles Dufresne with Carbon Market Watch. I think my question could be for anyone, but maybe especially for Owen and Renat. So going back to the discussion around the prerequisites that VCMI has, in our view as a watchdog NGO, this is a very important element of the guidance, and making sure that there are prerequisites that relate to the within value chain, so internal decarbonization of a company before they use the credits. So I wanted to hear a bit from you what you think the role of these prerequisites might be, and maybe more specifically for Owen, do you think there are prerequisites that companies should meet before using gold standard credits? And for Renat, are there prerequisites that companies should meet before Southpole would sell credits to them, or would you sell credits to any company?
Owen, do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, it philosophically, I suppose, semantically, I find it kind of interesting. I mean, Renat's point about should you drop the M from VCMI is getting to a question of, are they really prerequisites, or should it be read as a whole lexicon, as Rob said? And I think the latter would be true from our side, which is why we published our paper on what we think a company should be doing. And it's interesting, like, why is the voluntary carbon market the kind of cart that pulls the horse along sometimes? And I think, as Lydia said rightly earlier, it's actually a really small market. Why is it the thing that's prominently driving the discussion around the prerequisites to use it? I mean, it seems odd that that's the way around that we would phrase it. But I think it's because the carbon market has been, although small, it's visible and has had its controversies, and therefore, in the public perception, it sort of gets right at the kind of leading edge of how we want companies to act. Like, what is a good, directionally true, positive, fair company doing in the context of an emergency like climate and nature? And so it's sort of natural, I think, that the carbon market has pulled it along. And I mean, to sort of counter Renat's point about dropping the M, I think my suspicion will be at some point that would happen, right? That's a natural evolution. If it's the carbon market that pulls us into this conversation, at some point, the carbon market becomes the screwdriver you use, not the thing that drags the horse along in this analogy. So to get to the point of whether we would sell carbon credits to somebody not following that entire paper, the short answer is I think that's where we'll get to. So if you read our current claims guidelines associated with the standard, what it says, I think maybe too subtly to have been read by many, but it says that you can use that credits. If you want gold standard to stand with your claim, these are the things that need to be in place. So that's quite subtle for a reason, because it's very difficult to police claims from the supply side. The infrastructure you would need to do that is beyond our capacity right now. But at the same time, my selling arms analogy earlier, if somebody is found to be using our instruments egregiously, then we would want to be able to do something about that. So I can see that natural progression towards saying, yeah, actually, if you want to make the claims that you're directionally true, this is what you're going to have to you do. And if you get called out in public for that, gold standard will back you if you're following this thing. But if you're not following this thing, then you've used our instrument, and that's as much as you can really say.
Great. Thanks, Owen. And I've got to say, as your director of comms, I'm not a massive fan of the selling arms analogy that you used a couple of times.
What about the screwdriver one?
That one's fine. Renat, do you want to?
So perhaps to the second part of the question, which I find extremely interesting, the question ultimately, should you, for example, sell carbon to oil companies, right? First, very important to note, at Southpole, we have a policy since 2013 when the Kyoto Protocol collapsed, and we actually, for the first time, turned back to voluntary climate action because all our buyers dropped out, all the governments. We had a very strict rule that we will never ever award any label to any fossil fuel product or company. Full stop, nothing. Because there is no green oil, no green coal, nothing. The problem, however, was, to our disappointment, some of the companies started to create their claims on their own. So all of a sudden there was a climate neutral LNG shipment with Southpole credits. And then we got the question from the journalist, what can I, so that created big troubles in our company as well. Like, what do you do if people self-certify them and say, well, I got Southpole credits? Now, but to the bigger question is this, right? Let's get the figures right. Today, we have about $500 billion every year in worth of fossil fuel subsidies. Last year, with the price hike, the combined fossil fuel companies made different estimates around $500 to $600 billion profits, not revenues, profits. How big is our market? The total market is $2 billion. So if the oil, let's say the combined fossil fuel companies put 10% of their profits into funding climate action, that would essentially mean $50 billion every year for funding climate action. Now, in my opinion, in case we can do this without any notion of greenwashing at all, I go like, why wouldn't we take the money where it actually sits? And that was, by the way, one of the proposals that was floated last week at the Macron summit in Paris, a global tax on oil companies, or a global tax on shipping. It didn't go through, but I find the idea is actually worth considering. Why wouldn't those guys who make gazillions of dollars of profits put a portion of that money into the funding climate action? So, long story short, at Southpole, we have actually no problem with working with oil companies, gas companies, everybody, as long as there is absolutely no greenwashing, and as long as we are basically being there, as long as there's a genuine commitment for them to transform. But I think we have to, as tough as it is, we have to work with those companies too. They have to be part of it. They cannot just get away with all those profits without contributing.
Great, thank you. Lydia, Rob, would you like to come in on this question, or should we go for the next question?
Just very quickly, it was a really, really good question. Thank you, Gilles. My answer is not directly related to your question, but it's kind of related to some of the responses. And I just think it's important to keep in view how voluntary carbon markets finance is one instrument among various other instruments. And it only makes sense if voluntary carbon market finance is operating holistically and in consideration of other financing instruments within a country. So, if you're thinking about carbon markets and subsidies, and then it's just all, there's a huge amount of financing instruments out there. So ultimately, the world that we want to get to is where financing and instruments are all aligned, they're complementary, and you're not using different instruments which ultimately kind of contradict each other. So one other element which we do at VCMI is actually on the capacity side. So we've been working with government policymakers in low and middle income countries who are increasingly asking, what role does voluntary carbon market finance play in my sort of climate action and towards meeting and enhancing NDCs? How does it fit alongside other carbon financing instruments? What does Article 6 mean? What are the opportunities from VCMs versus others? And so that's a really key piece. So thinking about how the demand side integrity meets the supply side integrity, but also how the supply side integrity fits within the sort of the landscape of financing instruments, so that VCMs are actually delivering the impact that they need to deliver.
Great.
I'll just underscore the point on the links to the wider ecosystem, which I think speaks to the point of, are we talking about a market or are we talking about something broader? Really, we're talking about both. The market is a subset of how you solve a wider financing challenge. It's not going to do everything. The CCC, I think, put it quite well, the UK's Climate Change Committee, in that, the VCM can play a small but important role in UK net zero. And, wherever we land, we're approaching the question with that philosophy as well. So I think this is how everything sits together. And on the initial question, I think it's obviously for the likes of Gold Standard to think about their prerequisites, but I think it's also that slight differentiation between the individual credit and then the corporate claim, which are two different things. And the latter, as well as VCMI, also the transition planning regime that I talked about earlier, and the work that the TPT is doing to develop best practice for transition planning guidance for companies in any sector. It is also really important, notwithstanding what you then do in terms of carbon credits within or beyond that. So, thanks.
Great, thank you very much. And then I think there was someone at the front who's got a mic already. So.
I don't know if it's working. It's around the same topic, but it's more a comment, and I want to hear your thoughts. So today, throughout the day, and yesterday, we've been hearing a lot that we're trying to use the same tools that have created the problem to fix the problem. And if now we're in a transition stage of the carbon market with like everything that it's going to happen now with how we're going to relate with Article 6 and the compliance market. And I agree that the name of just calling it market, it brings that idea that you just want to create more capital out of it and you want to make a profit out of it. When in like the other sessions, we tend to refer to it as a tool just for impact funding. This is just to like, I don't know, just to hear your thoughts. Like, do we see that this could be like a turning moment of instead of calling it the voluntary carbon market, we could start just like really focusing on impact funding and scaling funding for climate action. Yeah, and we talked about the price as well. So just as another like comment, going into that direction and like the VCMI, especially like for Lydia, focusing on that demand side of the whole market. Could we think of having a minimum price? I mean, we've been talking about as well the whole day that even $50, it's low for certain type of projects. Could we even think about of just having like that cycle analysis of the real prices and collaborate and have like the same harmony in the market today to just have that transparency of how much actually it costs to have a high quality credit and a high quality ton equivalent of what we're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you. I think we might take another couple of questions. I'll go to my colleague at the back of the room.
Hi, so thank you very much. Great discussion. I'd really like to know, we are looking at claims for nature-based solutions, for landscapes, for biodiversity. What is the one thing that from carbon markets that you would say we should repeat? And what is the one thing we have learned we should not do from carbon markets for these other claims? Thank you.
Great, and we'll take one more question on the right.
Thank you. This is more of a comment, but I'm framing it as a question, and it's following the intervention earlier, and it's taking a bit of a step back and a bigger picture. I think we talk a lot about the carbon markets and the voluntary aspect of it, but we're looking that there's going to be more convergence or less distinction between voluntary and non-voluntary. So can we also start talking about claims for climate impact, no, or climate action that also take adaptation as part of the more holistic approach, where corporates will start having more responsibility and potentially more benefit to impact and funding these activities? It's more medium term. I know that right now we're focusing to get sorted the voluntary carbon market, but I think it's important to think the bigger picture and bring adaptation as part of the discussion.
Great. Thank you. Renat, do you want to start with the lessons from the carbon market for the NDS?
Yeah, and look, I think actually all the three questions and comments are completely linked. And they're pointing at the same root topic, which I find very important. And it's actually the reason why we created My Climate and Southpole back in the day. As students, we were fascinated by the idea that an externality, a ton of CO2 that just goes out, could have a price. Because if that was the case, you could use the market forces to solve an environmental problem. And I think a lot of the problems that we have is we kind of departed from that root element that is bonding everything together. All this controversy actually doesn't reflect that that's actually what we're trying to achieve. To your comment, yes, absolutely. I keep repeating this example. If, let's say, a farmer in Ghana is planting trees in her cocoa field and the price of carbon goes through the roof, you know what happens? This woman gets very rich, and that's good. That's it. I don't want this woman to be a beneficiary of my donation. No, I want her to be my business partner. She solves the problem, she reduces carbon, and she gets rich if the price goes up. That's the power of that system. And we have lost that power a little bit. That's the fascination of this whole topic. And that links very quickly to the other topics. The big lesson learned, Felicity, about the car markets, when we should have avoided this whole offsetting topic. So if you talk about biodiversity, don't call it the biodiversity offset. That's a recipe for disaster, a highway to hell. Don't do it. Call it biodiversity credit, biodiversity finance, biodiversity contribution, or funding climate action, funding biodiversity action, funding adaptation action, funding plastic action, funding education action, funding health action. Let's create systems where impact has a price, and we start creating instruments that honor that price. That's what we're after. None of these other weird things that just lead to greenwashing claims. So I think in this sense, all these interventions are linked and point to the same root cause that we have to change.
Owen, do you want to comment on that at all?
I think you're exactly right, all questions linked. I mean, maybe just two nuances. So the pricing of the externality is one of the critical components of the mechanism. I think over the 30 years of its existence, that externality has been the price of a carbon credit. And the original kind of idea of that marginal cost is that it would get so expensive to buy them that you would move to reduce your emissions internally even more. But that's very rose-tinted of a voluntary mechanism. No policy mechanism would be designed that way. And the reason is it's volatile. The price has never reached a point. In fact, at one point it was 10 cents a ton. It's, you'd buy that all day long rather than reduce your emissions if you could get away with it as a cynical company. So the pricing of the externality went wrong. Is there evidence that it will get back to a place where it would influence to that extent? Maybe, maybe not. I don't think you can rely on it. And so one of the things that we've and other civil societies have advocated for is that pricing of externality must come inbound to the company. And then that allows you to fund a wide variety of things, to Bernardo's point, adaptation, R&D, technology, enterprise, advocacy. So the carbon markets is a useful instrument for specific reductions or removals, but there are other enabling conditions that could be much more impactful if the externality is priced. And that's why SBTI has this beyond value chain mitigation. Unfortunately, chose VCM as an acronym, which wasn't super helpful. But that's why it's not called, voluntary offsetting. And so just completely agree, avoid offsetting in biodiversity. I'd go as far as well as saying nature positive implies some sort of mathematical resolution to the liability you have. I would avoid nature positive like it was the plague as well. Because what happens, as I said earlier, once you've got that claim, your instrument must meet it. It must deliver that claim. So you'll be designing up this instrument. Either there'll be a gap and you won't really be nature positive, or you'll have to design an instrument so onerous that it'll be too difficult for anybody to do. So there's a real opportunity to think, what do you want a company to do in biodiversity? What would they say about that? And design the instrument that suits exactly that. Otherwise, if you ratchet with the claim, the instrument has to ratchet with it, and so will the criticism.
Thank you, Owen. Lydia, would you like to come in on that point?
Yeah, just briefly to say that, voluntary carbon markets only exist because of a failure in policy. We shouldn't be where we are woefully behind. We're in a climate crisis. So we need all tools in the box now. And voluntary carbon markets, whether you call them markets or not, are one of those tools. We absolutely 100% agree, need them to be focused on impact. This is a purposeful market to deliver climate and social outcomes, so essentially delivering public goods. So we're in a situation where we need to develop incentives for private sector actors to undertake that action and deliver essentially what are public goods. So I think the only way that we can do that is if we build trust in the system based on clear, common, harmonized rules. Companies are not going to play if there's not a reputational benefit, if there's reputational risk. Why would they put millions and perhaps billions on the table? So I think trust is the key ingredient. And ultimately, that's what's going to drive price. If there's a trusted market which delivers sort of reputational returns, then that's what's going to drive price. Obviously, there are things that you can do in the meantime based on buyers clubs, etc., to artificially raise it. There are complications because even if a company buys a carbon credit at a certain price, what's to say the money that actually went to the ground to those who are delivering it? So there are mechanisms to drive price in the meantime, but ultimately, I think if we're going to get a market at meaningful value, then it needs to be based on the common rules. And just on the sort of broader point on regulation, I think the thing that we can do if we can build this market based on trust and rules is accelerate and create the space for policy and regulation, which is really, really where we need to be. We're not going to get where we need to be by voluntary action alone. So hopefully Rob and colleagues will follow in the footsteps of best practices and see what can be done through consumer regulation, financial regulation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think with that in mind for biodiversity, the thing that sort of voluntary tools can do is experiment, innovate, create the systems and build a sense of common best practice and create that space for a runway to regulation, which we really need to accelerate across all forms.
Maybe the V needs to go as well.
Oh yeah, 100%, yeah.
There you go. Well, challenge to you there, Rob. So,
I mean, we're opening the door for that learning, right? So, you know, to answer the first question on biodiversity and other sort of nature markets, I think there's a wealth of lessons from the carbon market. We're not short of them. One thing that jumps out to me is, you know, trying to build the principles in rather than hoping that they will evolve organically over time. And I think some of the work that DEFRA, the UK's Environment Ministry, is doing with the British Standards Institute to do some work on a nature investment standard that does learn from some of those lessons and involves working with VCM and others is sort of a good way of doing that. There are all sorts of obvious complications around trying to mathematicize different things that are not necessarily fungible. We have enough of those in carbon, so you know, we're thinking those through too. I'll repeat my call that, you know, we are launching a consultation later this year. We have already said within the Green Finance Strategy that two things that are really important to us in that are coherence with the wider policy regime and learning from the initiatives that some of which we've talked about today, and actually thinking quite explicitly about how those relate to A, a basis for international best practice, and B, how that should then be enshrined in the UK's policy and regulatory regime. So we're not avoiding that discussion at all. We're actually, you know, wanting to have it. Just a fair bit to work through, and we're waiting for the publications, which are very, very imminent. So just on the other question around, you know, markets and how that links to other things. So I think, you know, we would see markets, as I said, as playing a particular function. There's lots of analysis that, you know, carbon markets in general, voluntary market or not, do enable a more cost-efficient route to global net zero. And so how do you tap into that in a way that does provide the social protections and provide all of the things that you'd want it to? But it shouldn't detract from that wider discussion around financing. So there shouldn't be a trade-off between, you know, the voluntary carbon market and impact investing. There should be a parallel discussion on development finance, and we saw some of that, you know, with the Bridgetown agenda that Mia Motley has been promoting. And so I think there is a question of how all these things sit together and how do you maximize the information flow and learnings between them. You know, one thing for me, having worked in climate finance for a number of years and worked on programs that do results-based payment, now working a bit more with the private sector, and they're thinking about things like sustainability-linked loans, which also require, you know, MRV, and they allow impact investment, and they can learn from each other. So it's more, how do all of these things sit together? And I can't make grand political pronouncements as a policy official, but I think, you know, our job is to sort of get the architecture right and get the plumbing right, and then there is that sort of role of advocacy to try and sort of really get money flowing. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So we've got just 5 minutes left in this session, so probably time for a couple more quick questions. So if anyone has any more, please put your hands up in the middle there.
Jill Story, Ocean National Corporation. It's been a great conference. I've been here for 2 days, and we haven't spoken about the oceans. And for me, the oceans are the largest carbon sink and our biggest sort of opportunity for the future. And if we look at what the IPCC produced 2 years ago in terms of the carbon budget, and we look at where we are today, and if instead of looking at the 50% figure, which we look at the 83% chance of getting to 1.5 degrees, we've got sort of 12 months left. So sort of all of these corporate net zero commitments are important and great, but I sort of feel that the landscape has probably shifted in the last sort of 12 months in terms of our understanding about where we really are. And so some of the suggestions from Renat about looking at financing for impact, financing for climate action, I think that's really where we need to be, because we haven't really got the time. And we need to start to look at the ocean. The ocean's very difficult in terms of measuring, and there's a lot more research that needs to be done. But we need to get the finance into the oceans and start doing the experiments and starting to learn and starting to understand, because in the oceans we can sequester carbon at scale and for the longer term. So I'd just like to see if the panel have got ideas about how we can start to do that now. Thanks.
Thank you. And then I think there was someone just back in the middle, if you could pass the microphone that way.
Hi, Heidi Blake from The New Yorker. So I'm just really interested in the discussion about moving away from describing the voluntary carbon market as a market. And if that's the case, I'm intrigued as to your thoughts on the role of the sort of secondary market that Lydia touched on, and whether there should be any mechanism to reflect in the claims that are made the amount of the value of a carbon credit at the point of retirement that has been kind of taken up by that secondary market by kind of onward trading, or should there be a limit to the number of times a credit can be traded before it's retired, if we're thinking about making this more about sort of impact and less about kind of like, you know, less about kind of market forces?
Great, thank you. So should we do oceans first? Does anyone want to come in on the oceans point? Renat?
Perhaps I can just a short intervention. In fact, that would have been very close to my closing statement, because it's probably the last time I got the floor. Yes, absolutely. The ocean is a very typical example. It's complex. Not everything is clear. But when do we have to start with the funding? 1 year ago, not sometime in the future. And perhaps in this sense, my closing word on this is we have to somehow make risk-taking fashionable again. In the past 6 months, with all those controversies, I've seen the complete opposite happening. People are bunkered down in statements drafted by lawyers, and the only goal is not to be attacked. And that's actually killing any innovation and any risk-taking, and that's really unhealthy. So perhaps my call to all of you here is, of course, greenwashing is a very important problem. We never should do it, but let's be a little bit forthcoming with those companies who try hard to take a risk, who perhaps, for example, fund an ocean project, and then 2 years later you find that, oh, it was perhaps not the optimal project. Well, they tried at least, right? Let's keep in mind 7% of global companies, according to a study we did last year, have any climate targets at all. The other 93% are doing nothing. So let's not cancel those companies who are doing something, but let's involve them and invite them to improve.
I just agree. I think the previous question around voluntary and regulation. Regulation tends to be you shall do this, you shan't do that, and the beauty of voluntary action is in its inspiration. If you're trying to reduce traffic in a city centre, you can ban cars, or you can charge for parking or whatever. But actually, the most effective policy nudges are always the ones that encourage people to get out of their cars, right? To make it a nicer place to be on foot. And I think that speaks to that really nicely, what Renat said. And one of the question about renaming the voluntary carbon market, I think it's more like the voluntary carbon market is a tool within the bucket of taking responsibility for your ongoing emissions, but it's been the de facto way to take responsibility for your ongoing emissions. That's the piece that has to change. In fact, further, offsetting as a use of the market has been the de facto way to take responsibility for your ongoing emissions. That needs to change. But I think to the oceans question, what's really interesting, it would be very hard, I think, for Rob, I mean the UK government, not Rob specifically, to say to companies, you must finance ocean. I mean, a company, you'd get a massive lobby back, like what's that got to do with us? But voluntary action can go there, because if you're taking responsibility for your ongoing emissions, it's finance that could be spent on anything, providing it's additional. And oceans, clean cooking, virgin forests, They're difficult to regulate. Nobody likes to be regulated for their cooking. And so you kind of have this, not in value chains, the ocean's not anybody's value chain. So you have this opportunity with this specific bucket of finance to finance things that others can't reach. I'm not sure regulation alone can do that. I think voluntary inspiration has to be part of it, that kind of risk-taking mentality.
Great, thank you. And just I'm afraid we've come to the end of this excellent discussion, but any final points from particularly Lydia and Rob who have not had the last chance?
I mean, probably a slight genericism, but I think, ultimately, I speak sort of to the oceans question, but I think across the whole of the discussion, the ultimate policy incentive is to get the most amount of effective funding to where it needs to be for the maximum impact. So if you approach everything through that lens, you end up in a place where you need to have the right principles, but you also need to cultivate innovation. And I would say that there's nothing about the voluntary carbon market's existence that prohibits other voluntary action. And so that's a bit of a sort of where the likes of Gold Standard and Southpole are sort of the experts. And thanks a lot for the discussion.
Great. Okay.
Final one from me. So I think, the overriding message from the whole conversation is we need action now. Responsible, high-integrity action. We're launching the claims code tomorrow, so please sign up. We're already onboarding companies who are going to be among the first to make these claims, and I really hope all of you will encourage companies to come on board as well, so that we build that momentum, that groundswell, so that it becomes inevitable that companies increasingly take the responsibility, decarbonize, additionally invest in these high impact outcomes, and with transparency along the way. Coming back to the point on price, transparency around retiring credits at the moment is pretty patchy. Let's say there's elements in the claims code criteria which increase that, but there's much more that can be done. There are examples around the Leaf Coalition where that actually happens, restrictions on secondary trading. So there's much more innovation to happen. We need action now based on these clear rules that we have, and we need to build from there.
Great. All that remains is for me to thank our excellent panelists.